This week, how can we better protect farm workers? Or, I don't know, protect them at all. But first, I'm Quinn Emmett, and this is Important, Not Important. Science for people who give a shit. The newsletter features the most important science news, how to think about it, and what the hell we can all do about it. Hit subscribe right now to get this newsletter and my conversations with the world's smartest people every single week. You can find the email version and links to everything at importantnotimportant.com or right in your show notes. And now, today's big question. How do we better protect America's farm workers, who often aren't Americans? If there's a TLDR semicolon thing to this rant, it's this. America has a well-documented history of relying on disposable farm workers. And as climate change makes that job even more dangerous, which is really saying something, landowners, elected officials, and corporate powers remain disinclined to protect, much less support or nourish, the hands that literally feed them and us. So we're going to have to make them do it. So many regions around the world and in the US are cooking. And it's important to remember how interconnected our climate and weather systems are. Carbon emissions don't respect borders. Florida's melting? Well, it started in Africa. And it started in Africa because of emissions produced here in the US and in China and in Europe. El Nino is here finally, and while there's lots of talk, online at least, about how devastatingly hot the oceans are, something we're stupidly usually prone to ignoring because most of us do not live in the oceans, I'm here today to vent more specifically about the inexcusable broad lack of protections for farm workers on land, why it matters to all of us, and what the hell we can do about it. Some background. Per whole shitload of research, farm workers in the US are something like 35 times more likely to die of heat than other workers. Now, your gut response might be, yes, but isn't that obvious? They're outside exposed to the elements and also pesticides. And I'd say, you're fucking right. Odds are you're working from home. So take a look around your kitchen. Put your hands on some cherries, grapes, strawberries, oranges, or peaches. Pick one up. Where did it come from? Who picked it? What sort of conditions, from heat to pesticides, were the crop and crop picker exposed to? And what happens if that person suffers or even dies because of those conditions? Would you notice? What if I told you these essential workers didn't have to die or even come close to it, but that generations of bad guys have proven that they don't care if they do? Let's catch up a little bit. Ignoring, for the sake of brevity, which I know is not something I really do, the myriad macroeconomic arguments about America's 246-ish years of formal slavery. Understand that, like we talked about earlier, we built this city on enslaved labor, not, in fact, rock and roll. And that fine tradition actually continues today, just adjusted slightly. We no longer directly steal people in mass from their countries and sell them on the waterfronts of New Orleans and Charleston and New York. That, again, formally at least, ended after Lincoln, by way of Grant and Sherman, yikes, kicked the shit out of the Confederacy. Now, we spent the next couple hundred years not really doing reconstruction, denying former slaves and their descendants any real participation in the wealth game, while the rest of us industrialized everything inside our borders, warming the entire planet, and pretty unevenly. So we needed new farm workers, since we obviously still eat food. The problem is we don't totally know how to grow food without what is basically free labor. So enter Mexico and friends. Our current generation of farm workers, the National Center for Farm Worker Health estimates 70% of agricultural workers in the U.S. were foreign-born. Again, this current generation, they go through journeys from hell to come here just to die in the sun, from one boiling country to another. The legacy of slave labor remains in a bazillion ways, including how farmers are mostly unprotected because a bunch of racist Southern politicians, elected by racist Southern plantation owners, decided not to include farm workers in the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, And now you might be saying that was almost 100 years ago, things have changed, and I would say, actually, not much, and we're going to talk about it. So, look, we don't call farm work slavery anymore, of course. And farm workers are actually far less likely to be black than they were before, during actual slavery. But that doesn't mean that the workers that pick and package our food, one, didn't come from somewhere else, and two, aren't intentionally expendable. Now, again, you might argue with that, but at the end of this essay, I think you might have a hard time doing that. 98% of rural land in America is currently owned by white people. The Center for Migration Studies estimates that 283,000 of our current farm workers are undocumented immigrants who, despite the efforts of many awesome folks included in the action steps above, have no real clear path to citizenship and have no real health protections. Probably half of the undocumented farm workers are in California, and the rest are spread among the Midwest and the South, where the ancient soil, it was once plankton, they call it the Black Belt, is so goddamn rich. The soil is so incredible. It spawned the bulk of all that slavery. And, of course, on the eve of the 2020 presidential election, an enormously fascinating and popular Twitter thread from Latif Nasser, a co-host at Radiolab, which we'll put in the notes. Now, in the actual newsletter, I shared some warming stripes images. I was going to do it for every state without farm worker protections to show how hot it's gotten and where these folks have to work. But it turns out most states don't have those protections. So I included, I think, California, Florida, Georgia, but also Mexico to show why those folks have to leave there. So anyways, the point is, none of this is an accident. But now, with the climate crisis here, our oceans and our land and our crops and the people who tend to all of them are in deep shit. Let's talk briefly about what that means, what heat does to the body. And again, briefly, because I think you're going to get the point. Now, you can pause here to read Jeff Goodell's new book, The Heat Will Kill You First, which is subtle. Or you can stay right here with us and listen, however briefly, about the work of Roxana Chicas, an El Salvadorian-born immigrant, nurse, researcher from Emory University, who spent the past decade or so investigating the effects of heat on farm workers' health. So besides nausea, muscle cramps, crippling headaches, vomiting, and fatigue, there's this as documented in the Washington Post. One of Chica's studies, published in 2018, collected blood and urine samples from 192 farm workers over 555 workdays during the summers of 2015 and 2016 to measure hydration and kidney function. They found that on any given day that the farm workers were tested, 33% of them had incurred kidney injury, and that the likelihood of injury increased with the heat index. Again, that was 5 years ago. Okay, again, I feel like this is enough data to move on to how we're choosing not to protect them from these very specific real risks. Which again, as we always frame here, are opportunities to make different choices, for us to do something different. So, again, let's kick this section off by recalling how dangerous it can be for undocumented workers in any industry to call attention to their status unless they absolutely have to. So we should actually assume there's a fair bit of suffering and or death that simply isn't being counted. From heat, from pesticides, from heat and pesticides. Speaking of pesticides, it may not surprise you that the same agency is responsible for approving pesticides and enforcing their safe use, and it's rife with lobbying. Now, last year, Civil Eats, which you should absolutely subscribe to, highlighted a lawsuit and a bunch of reports revealing how OSHA, OSHA, does little to enforce pesticide safety rules, leaving workers with damaged eyes, torched skin, and children born with defects, all for basically a better tomato crop. To protect themselves, because no one else will do it, farm workers are often advised to wear long pants and long sleeves to protect against pesticides, which is about as helpful as school kids hiding under their desks from a nuke. Now you might be asking, OSHA, what the hell? Where are the feds? What's going on here? Well, versions of congressional bills that amend the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 and provide for overtime pay have been introduced over the years, only to not pass, to flounder. A new one, the Fairness for Farm Workers Act, is actually out now, but this will surprise you, it's seeing little enthusiasm from the right, the same parts of the country that turned against the bill in 1935 and 38. So 2 years ago, the new Biden administration and OSHA actually announced plans to develop new rules to protect workers from heat-related illnesses. Well, it's July 2023, it's the hottest month of all time, and 2 years into Biden's pretty successful industrial climate administration, and those rules do not yet exist. Meanwhile, Congress continues to negotiate this year's Farm Bill, one of the most ridiculous and enormous policy instruments on the entire planet. So it's renewed every 5 years like some bizarre pagan ritual. It's due again this very September. The Farm Bill has, for 100 years basically, required members of Congress and a gazillion lobbyists to wrestle together the country's many agricultural and nutritional priorities, which often compete against each other, into a sprawling package that still mostly benefits monocrops and white landowners, who again still own 98% of rural land in the United States. So, it's terrible outside. We get it. Many groups are pushing for this year's version of the Farm Bill to be a climate bill, which is kind of meaningless since climate is everything, but we get the point here, right? Shit's changing fast. We only do this every 5 years. We're not doing enough. We should do this now. So the 2023 version of the Farm Bill should reckon with how much has changed already. Hotter nights, changing frost dates in the southeast, desertification in the west. Despite leaving 1.3 million acres unplanted in 2022 due to drought conditions, leading to $3 billion in losses, California isn't alone in what's happening here. Not even close. Right? Florida's citrus crop has basically migrated north to Georgia, whose own peach crop got crushed because of the frost dates and the heat. Texas is enormously dry and running out of groundwater. Across the country, corn, cotton, rice, olives, wheat, and other row crops, the ones we subsidize, have just been punished by drought in recent years. And all those losses have sent insurance payments through the roof. And all those checks might just be keeping industrial farmers from moving to more climate-friendly farming practices. Now, if this sounds to you like coastal, floodplain, and fire-threatened real estate insurance markets that we've talked a lot about recently, you're paying attention. It's the same deal. So what does the new Farm Bill have planned? On the docket, paying farmers to use more of those climate-friendly conservation practices. That's great. Not on the docket. Actually moving subsidies from monocrops and from ridiculously high input farming to more diversified production like legumes, beans. So, will armies of competing lobbyists build a bill that recognizes the immense change on our doorstep and that plans for and even tries to change the future? Probably not. We're realists here. But at this rate, a hell of a lot is going to change before the next bill in 2028. So it would be prudent to do these things. Subsidizing climate-friendly farming practices like cover cropping, utilized by indigenous peoples since the beginning of time, basically, would be a start. And funding is growing for those methods and others like hedgerows and silvopasture. But this is terrible. It's a drop in a very hot ocean. Meanwhile, quote, 86% of indigenous farming communities lacked a single financial institution to access loans or capital within their borders, end quote. And because billions of the Farm Bill's sweet cash still go straight to traditional commodities, industrial farms, and their owners, small farms continue to have an impossible time getting insurance and staying in business, much less competing on the good days with the big boys. The Farm Bill has long recognized that shit happens, of course, which is why it provides farm owners with insurance for crop loss due to drought, etc. Catastrophic peach losses in Georgia? Great, you were compensated with a natural disaster declaration and all kinds of insurance stuff. Here's my question. How come farm owners, again mostly for row crops, not peaches to be fair, get annual protections from crop loss due to climate change, but the pickers do not. What happens when that same drought, or storms, or floods, or wildfire smoke causes farm workers, who are again mostly undocumented immigrants with no path to citizenship, what happens when they lose their jobs or someone in their family dies? Well, they certainly couldn't afford housing any longer, which brings us to housing. We know that housing is a climate fix. It's a catastrophic problem nationwide, but especially in California, and especially for 400,000 to 800,000 underpaid farm workers who harvest the bulk of our country's fruit, vegetable, and nuts out there. 77% of whom live in overcrowded or extremely overcrowded conditions, with multiple families sharing bedrooms, living rooms, garages, and other spaces. Now, California has committed recently hundreds of millions of dollars towards migrant and farm worker housing, but it's nowhere near enough, and now California's surplus is long gone. Food is also pretty hard to come by, which is amazing because they're farm workers, and that's because straight up undocumented immigrants aren't eligible for SNAP assistance, the same assistance that Republicans are trying to cut further. Now, there are a number of groups of non-citizens that are eligible, but the caveats involved are ridiculous. You can read about it in the newsletter. And surrounding all this is the never-ending heat. Housing keeps you safe from heat if you have power and air conditioning. Food can help keep you safe, can nourish you. The heat is never-ending because the average number of days spent working in unsafe conditions is expected to double by mid-century. The heat is never-ending because so few states, except for California, Oregon now, Washington, Minnesota, among them, have actual farm worker protections. That's it. It's never-ending because there are actual fucking monsters in the world, bad guys, like Greg Abbott, who rescinded mandatory water breaks in the middle of this historic heat wave. The heat is never-ending because farm workers are often paid by the piece, not the hour, which means taking breaks in the shade, no matter how you feel, equals lost income. Here's a quote from an article. Severa would push herself to work faster, through sweat and thirst to exhaustion, even a feeling of suffocation, because the heat exacerbates her asthma. She knew working so hard in the heat made her feel ill, but if she wasn't cutting, she wasn't earning money. And fern cutters, as she did, are generally paid by the bunch, not the hour. She gets 45 cents per bunch, 20 fern sprays to a bunch. So, what are we doing? Well, in the early COVID era, California actually prioritized vaccines for farm workers, finally, temporarily calling them essential workers, as the virus just ravaged their ranks because, again, they're living on top of each other. Here's my question. Are they essential fucking workers or not? When are we going to decide that? Well, we should also ask, why isn't it that way yet? And the answer is greed and power and lobbying to buy more power. Undocumented workers may not have much power, but the rest of us sure fucking do. Unions may be at their lowest point in a century, but literally today, this week, this month, more and more workers of every flavor, from screenwriters to actors to UPS drivers, are fucking done. Labor journalist Hamilton Nolan wrote in his piece this week, his newsletter, How Things Work, he said, quote, Amazon is quite willing to spend any amount of money and piss upon the spirit of the law in order to prevent their employees at one single warehouse from getting a collective bargaining agreement, something they are absolutely entitled to by American law and more generally by universal human rights. And Sarah Nelson, by way of Mother Jones, by way again of Hamilton Nolan, said, the capitalists say there is no need of labor organizing, but the fact that they themselves are continually organizing shows their real beliefs. And she's right. If industry lobbying groups in the fucking Sun Valley Conference aren't organizing, I don't know what it is. Look up how much all of these companies spend on lobbying each year. It's incredible. These trillion-dollar corporations and billionaires simply do not care about you. And they are constantly, relentlessly putting enormous pressure on state and federal legislators to put you in harm's way in exchange for profits. They often write the bills themselves. Now, all that should remind you of a certain industry that rhymes with fossil fuels, reported by friend of the pod and legendary investigative journalist Amy Westervelt, cited that the oil and gas industry is dangerous for its workers, obviously, with a fatality rate 7 times higher than the national average, according to a 2013 study. So anyways, who does give a shit? Well, we fucking do. There's a reason metaphors like grassroots campaigns and building from the ground up are so prevalent, especially when we're talking about farm workers. Without a firm foundation, compounded across people and time, nothing meaningful gets done, nothing grows, which is exactly why we're all here today. Is there any more apt example than protecting the hands that feed us, that get the food out of the ground? You know and I know now that if we stop new emissions, new warming stops too. But along the way, we are also going to attack every step of the farm-to-table supply chain. 73% of Gen Zs told McKinsey they're concerned about the environmental impact of what we eat. Because if coral reefs are our measuring stick for hotter oceans, outdoor workers are like the canaries in the climate coal mine. What happens to them is terrible, but not in isolation. The heat and the storms and the flooding are coming for everyone. That's the opportunity to turn it around. It's going to take everyone to turn back the tide. How does UPS think 24.3 million packages a day are going to get delivered when 340,000 workers, including the 55% of Teamsters represented who work part-time, walk out? How low do those $14 billion in adjusted profits go then? How will real estate funds earn returns and build wealth when real estate is no longer insurable, leaving millions in debt and without roofs over their heads? How will we survive another pandemic without 500,000 new community health workers, better and more accessible primary care, mental health care for essential workers, and another 500,000 new nurses? We won't. The time is to identify and protect essential workers, especially the most vulnerable and essential among us. That time is now. But as always, we have to and we get to walk and chew gum at the same time. To protect farm workers today and stop new emissions at the same time, because even if they do get time in the shade, or God forbid, fucking air conditioning, or have some more room to sleep, what happens when the power goes out or the grid fails? What happens if we don't build these 75,000 new miles of transmission for all this glorious new solar and wind? Well, we're all fucked, is what happens. It's perfect that our most essential workers are also our most vulnerable. But it doesn't have to be that way. So let's spend all of our time doing everything we can to protect them and to build a more inclusive and resilient food system along the way. That's it for this week. Hit subscribe to get next week's issue straight to your feed. Jesus, to go deeper, visit importantnotimportant.com. That's it. Thanks for being a part of our community, and thanks for giving a shit. Have a great weekend.